The purpose of this press availability is to announce this administration's intention not to file for an extension with regard to Real ID, but because there is a law in the books here in South Carolina that bars us from doing so. But it's as well our intention to ask that South Carolina be treated by Department of Homeland Security and by extension the federal government the same as it is electing to treat Montana and New Hampshire and a variety of other states that find themselves in the same somewhat unusual spot that we find ourselves in South Carolina, with a law in the book that prohibits participation in Real ID, but at the same time material compliance, not because of Real ID, but because we in South Carolina care just as much about security of our driver's licenses as people in Washington, D.C. And so I've got a couple of different thoughts. This is something that a lot of people feel very strongly on, as is witnessed by the fact that we normally have a lot of press conferences and press availabilities without people holding signs as you all are today. But I think it's important to walk through a couple of fundamentals of what got us to where we are and why we are right here. One is South Carolina happens to be more than 90% compliant with what is dictated by Real ID. Not because of Real ID, but because, again, Marcia, there she's hiding around the corner. You can stand right here. Come on, you don't have to hide behind a column. Anyway, Marcia and her team at DMV have worked earnestly to try and make our licenses more secure in South Carolina because, again, we care about this, just as people across this country at the state level care passionately about this issue. And so with these 14 provisions, ahead of what would have been the timeline as dictated by Real ID, they've been enacted. There are 2 provisions over here that are pending, and 3, in essence, that we're prohibited from doing based on the law as it stands with Real ID. I think that this is in contrast. When you look at some states out there, I think it's important to recognize that there are about 8 states out there that don't even require verifying legal status for a driver's license. So here you have South Carolina that is one of the most secure licensing states in the country, and you have other folks that aren't, which goes back to this larger notion of federalism. And so what we would say would be, look, states have historically held this responsibility, that this is a responsibility that's been vested at the state level, and that there's something that we can handle. And where there are laggards, because there have been laggards, then with incentive, encourage those states to come up to speed rather than, in essence, having the federal government take over through what some see as a national ID card, the function of DMV offices across the country.
Yes.
And for citizens, I think it's very important, and this is well illustrated with the folks that have shown up here today, that people really look at the underlying fundamentals of what Real ID does or does not represent, and to look past the perception or perceived inconveniences that could or would not come our way based on what Department of Homeland Security would do, and to look at the policy itself. And so I'd like for just a couple minutes to walk through what we see as some of the policy concerns with regard to Real ID. And I do this in respectful tone. I do this in hope that folks in Congress and at the department level will take these ideas and do something with them. I put these into letter form in a letter that I personally sent to Secretary Chertoff himself. And my point is, in some ways, Secretary Chertoff is in an unenviable spot in being required to implement a law that was never debated in the U.S. Congress, and that wouldn't it be helpful to say, wait, here's some problems and let's have a national debate about this, which would bring me, in essence, to my first point. We believe, with millions of other Americans, that national policy should be debated, not dictated.
Yes.
And fundamentally, this law was never debated. It was attached as a rider to a supplemental bill that was to give aid to tsunami victims in 2005 and folks fighting in the Middle East. That is the kind of bill that nobody in Congress votes against, and so not surprisingly, this bill went through. But it went through without ever having a committee debate at the House level or in the Senate level. And it's our humble submission to folks, again, at the national level, that folks actually go back and debate the merits or demerits of what, again, some presume to be a national ID card through Real ID. Secondly, we would say that this represents a very, very substantial unfunded federal mandate, and it's getting to the point of breaking point with regard to federal unfunded mandates. The National Conference of State Legislators, and I see several state legislative related folks in the back of the room, actually deemed this as the most egregious example of an unfunded federal mandate. If you look at the numbers, it was originally estimated to cost $23 billion. Those numbers were down revised to $9.9 billion. Now, leaving aside the assumptions that go with that downward revision, which is historically not the way that things go in actuality in Washington, if you even still accepted that as the true number, what that means is that the federal government would pay for 2% of the cost of Real ID, and states and citizens would pay the other 98%, and yet the federal government would dictate the rules with regard to a Real ID system that they would not be funding. And so our point has been, wait, this doesn't work at a couple different levels. It doesn't work, one, from the standpoint of sustainability of spending in Washington, D.C. There is a runaway train in Washington with regard to federal spending. And, you've got right now David Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States of America, talking about the threats to our republic based on runaway spending in Washington, D.C. That in total, that number is $50 trillion when you include Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And it amounts to about $450,000 per household in the United States of America. His point is that kind of debt can be crippling in the long run to that which makes our republic work. And so unfunded mandates, in essence, sustain and continue that process, because now you're handing the bill to somebody else for the cost of action in Washington, D.C. So if there was ever a bill in which to draw the line in the sand with regard to unfunded mandates, this seems to us to be it. Yes. Secondly, we would say that it's a particular problem in this budget year, because in this budget year for South Carolina and for frankly many other states across the country, we're going to not see the revenue rises that we've seen over the last couple of years. Now, when you talk about a $116 million unfunded mandate, it's a $9.9 billion overall unfunded mandate to the Republic, but a $116 million unfunded mandate to the state of South Carolina, what you're now doing is you're dictating state policy. Because it means you, at the state level, got to come up with other cuts to other areas of government spending at the state level, or you got to raise taxes. But you got to do one of those two, because we have a balanced budget requirement in the state of South Carolina. So we think it's particularly problematic now. We think it's also particularly problematic for states that are in storm-prone areas. We don't know if we'll ever be hit by a terrorist in South Carolina, but I can guarantee you we will be hit by another hurricane. I don't know when, but I know that we will be hit by another, and then another, and then another after that. And so what we've historically done with Homeland Security grants is to take that money and put it into interoperability with regard to, for instance, things like our radio system. And so whether it's an event borne by God or an event borne by man, we can respond in an emergency level, on an emergency basis. What these grants right now that would fund Real ID come from are from other Homeland Security grants. So you're taking out of the one pocket to put in the other, which ultimately, from our state, given that we're a storm-prone state, weakens our long-term emergency preparedness as a state. I would thirdly say that Real ID will substantially raise wait times. Marcia and her team at DMV have lowered the wait times from about an hour to about 15 minutes. If we institute Real ID, those wait times will go up to, in her estimate, somewhere between an hour or two. And the real productivity costs to South Carolinians that at this point have not been calculated into the real cost of Real ID. What I would suggest is that if the federal government was bent on a national ID system, then tie it to the passport or tie it to some other form of national ID and deal with both the financial and the political costs that would come to the federal government in that process. I would say, fourth, this is a step against limited government. And the greatest homeland security that we have is liberty. It's important that we never forget that. And there is a delicate balancing act, because the Founding Fathers saw one of the greatest threats to liberty a too strong or too vigorous federal government. And so they put in place checks and balances at the state level, at the local level, and it is a balancing act. Right now, what you would have with Real ID is states acting as the proxy for the federal government in instituting a national ID, upsetting the balance that's historically existed at a state level, but also upsetting it at the individual level. Take, for instance, this notion of doing something as seemingly insignificant as visiting your member of Congress. The Real ID dictates that you have to have a Real ID card to go into a federal building. Now, I had countless meetings when I was a member of the United States Congress with constituents, and I had no details as to their background, and that was, I think, great in the balance of power, because we weren't dictating their background. We were debating. I misspoke. We were not debating their background. We were debating where I stood on a particular issue and whether or not that represented the people